No country on Earth has more military bases abroad than the United States. With bases in places like the Caribbean, the Azores, then countless ones all over Europe, stretching into the Arabian Peninsula, to Kenya in Africa, Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean, Singapore in Southeast Asia, to Australia, and dozens of bases in Japan and Korea. In total, the US operates bases in more than 70 countries spanning the entire globe and is able to project power virtually everywhere. But there is one base that is completely different from all of them, because usually these bases are in allied countries with which the US has good relations and military cooperation. But not this one, the US base in Cuba. It is called Guantanamo Bay, and unlike the other bases, this one is located in a country that the US is in conflict with. The US considers Cuba a state sponsor of terrorism, and Cuba considers the US presence in their country illegal. The base is a place of extreme contrasts. Some parts of it look so much like a typical American city, and a pretty nice one actually. There are schools, sports fields, there's a McDonald's where you can liberate your day by eating a McMuffin. And then there are these suburban-style houses where US military personnel can live. There's even a somewhat makeshift 9-hole golf course right on the base. The greens, little islands surrounded by the dirt.
I'd have to say this is probably the strangest course I've played. It is very challenging.
But right next to this seemingly typical American town, there are large detention camps housing some of the US highest security prisoners. Camps that have caused political controversy over decades. For this extensive documentary, I set myself the goal to understand this unique place, because Guantanamo Bay plays an important role that goes far beyond the headlines during the War on Terror. This is America's most controversial base, explained. So here's the deal. I'm building up to something with this video. Throughout this story, I will be trying to view Guantanamo Bay as a sort of metaphor, because I believe that this military base can represent the complicated relationship between the United States and the rest of the world. And I've chosen 4 themes to guide this idea. First, there's independence, a word that means so much in how the US defines itself, but also how it views its ties with other nations. And independence is the perfect keyword to lead us to our first question. How did the US acquire this piece of land in the first place? And why is there a US base in Cuba? The answer, not surprisingly, is by force. But not by war with Cuba, but instead with Spain. Christopher Columbus had claimed Cuba for Spain in 1492, and for centuries it was part of the Spanish Empire, which at its largest extent stretched all across the Americas. But in the late 1800s, the Spanish hold had significantly decreased, and Cuba and Puerto Rico remained the last Spanish holds in the region. Cubans began to fight for independence, and for years the United States watched on the sidelines, until they couldn't anymore. Disturbing reports began making their way into the US news cycle. Cuban rebels fighting for independence were getting support from local farmers who provided housing and food to the resistance fighters. And to put a stop to this, Spain decides to move anyone who lives in the countryside into literal concentration camps. Anyone who refuses to relocate to these camps is killed, and within these camps, diseases and starvation quickly spread. Hundreds of thousands of Cubans die in these camps, and the American public becomes sympathetic as they hear more horror stories about what their neighbors across the Gulf are being subjected to, and they begin to ask their government to step in. The pressure from the American public and the desire to push the last remnants of European powers out of the Americas finally leads to the United States joining the fight. Just a little over 120 years earlier, the US had fought its own war for independence, and now it is helping Cuba do the same. The war doesn't last long after this. Spain agrees to give up its last remaining colonies, and suddenly, Cuba is freed. Except, actually, it isn't. The treaty between the United States and Spain guarantees the independence of Cuba, but it allows the US to occupy the island. In turn, the US makes clear to Cuba that it will only withdraw its troops if Cuba agrees to its own treaty with the United States. A treaty that includes leasing land to the US for a naval station, the very one that would become Guantanamo Bay. Cuba, in no position to negotiate, has little choice but to agree, and the lease is signed. A lease that has no expiration date and can only be terminated if both countries agree. With the Guantanamo Bay naval base established, the United States begins sending annual payments for the lease to Cuba in the amount of $2,000 paid in gold coins. And the US establishes a permanent camp on the island. They built housing for military personnel, and they even built a baseball field. The US has fought for Cuban freedom, but it made sure that it can shape what that freedom looks like. And it will not take long until the relationship changes drastically. With Cuba now left to its own devices, a series of various presidents and dictators rule the country, leading up to US-backed dictator Fulgencio Batista. Here he is with US President Eisenhower. For the US, the situation couldn't be much better. Guantanamo Bay becomes an important port for the United States Navy in the Caribbean. In 1931, a grass runway is set up by the bay. A decade later, that runway is paved, and another runway is built on the other side of the bay, which is eventually extended so it can accommodate newer jet aircraft.
On the southeast coast of Cuba, Guantanamo's commodious and well-sheltered harbor can accommodate the entire U.S. fleet.
The base's presence is tolerated by Cuba. After all, it even helps their economy, with thousands of workers crossing the border to the base every day.
1,200 United States Marines are sailing aboard the Army Transport Barnett for winter training in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. U.S. Devil Dogs, off to safeguard our new outpost.
However, after just a few decades of peaceful coexistence, everything changes. In 1959, Fidel Castro successfully overthrows Batista's dictatorship, and he installs a new communist regime, one that quickly becomes very friendly with the Soviet Union, the arch-nemesis to the United States. And with that, the Cold War between these two superpowers has reached Guantanamo Bay.
Castro marks the second anniversary of his revolution with the biggest military parade ever staged in Cuba. President Eisenhower broke off diplomatic relations with a message read by Press Secretary Haggerty.
Meanwhile, our sympathy goes out to the people of Cuba, now suffering under the yoke of a dictator.
After decades of toleration for the base, Cuba's new leader Castro has a very clear demand. He wants the land back for Cuba. Since, according to the treaty, both countries need to agree, and war against the powerful United States is not an option, there is little Castro can do, except, perhaps, turn to the Soviet Union. Strengthening this new alliance might offer protection, and just maybe enough leverage to push the Americans out. For the typical American, the tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union had so far only been felt far away from home turf. Proxy wars in Asia, with American and Soviet forces supporting opposite sides, and heavy militarization in Europe. But Cuba's alliance with the Soviet Union changes this. Suddenly, the Cold War was just 90 miles away from Florida. As the Iron Curtain is placed down in Europe in the form of walls and fences, another Iron Curtain rises just outside the border of Guantanamo Bay, except this one is made of cactus. Cuban troops are deployed to plant a large cactus strip around the American base.
The Cubans have planted a cactus curtain around the base, 75 feet wide. It is a vigorous plant as effective as a wire fence.
Looking at the base today, you can see the outline right here. And then you see a second perimeter around it on the Cuban side. The term cactus curtain is used to this day to describe the border between the base and the rest of Cuba. But the Cactus border was just the beginning, because both the Cuban and the American militaries planned an even deadlier deterrent: landmines. Around 55,000 mines are placed in this strip, making it one of the largest minefields of its time. With tensions so high, it feels like it's only a matter of time before something drastic happens. And so it does. In response to the United States placing nuclear missiles in Italy and Turkey, where they are closely within the reach of the Soviet Union now does the same, and it stations its own nuclear missiles in Cuba. The US publishes a series of photos showing these missile bases in Cuba, and the situation escalates.
The presence of these large, long-range, and clearly offensive weapons of sudden mass destruction constitutes an explicit threat to the peace and security of all the Americans. To halt this offensive buildup, a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated.
The U.S. threw up a steel fence, prepared to stop any vessel carrying materials of war.
Both the US and the Soviet Union are now within striking distance of each other, and nuclear war seems closer than ever before. Immediately, alarms ring out through the base of Guantanamo Bay, ordering all civilians to evacuate.
Over 3,000 Navy and Marine wives and children are evacuated from Guantanamo.
With little time, pets are left behind, and each person carries only one suitcase of belongings, not knowing if they will ever be able to return to their homes again. The evacuees join the world as everyone watches and waits, until at last, everyone can finally breathe easy once again.
Soviet Chairman Khrushchev decided to dismantle the bases in Cuba and to remove the offensive weapons. The missiles that had threatened the US went back where they came from.
The Soviet Union agrees to take its missiles out of Cuba, in exchange for the United States to agree not to attack or invade Cuba, as well as a secret deal to also remove its missiles from Turkey. Though the immediate crisis is over and civilians are able to return to their homes, not everything is back to normal. Castro still wants the base gone, and he starts to reject the checks that the United States has been sending regularly to pay for the lease. He also shuts down a pipeline that supplies the base with fresh water. Castro offers to supply 1 hour of water per day for humanitarian needs, but not any more beyond that. This offer is rejected by the Americans. Instead, tanker ships filled with water are sent to Guantanamo, while workers construct a desalination plant. To this day, the base has to operate autonomous from the rest of Cuba. Ocean water is turned into drinking water by 2 desalination plants. Electricity comes from a diesel generator plant, as well as from wind turbines that were installed in 2002, and supplies are shipped in from the United States. To this day, Cuba has rejected every US lease payment since the Castro's family leadership began. And that choice to stay, even when unwelcome, is not unique to Guantanamo, but can be seen as a constant in how the US tries to build global presence, as no other country on Earth maintains such a vast military footprint around the globe. And the challenges the United States faces at Guantanamo Bay are often the very same it struggles with on a larger scale. This same pattern also shows up in the next chapter of the base: immigration. In 1991, just a stone's throw away from Guantanamo Bay, unrest in Haiti ramps up. The Haitian president was overthrown by a military dictatorship, and now thousands of Haitians are fleeing using makeshift rafts, many of whom are intercepted by the US Coast Guard and sent to Guantanamo Bay, as the base soon becomes the symbol of the crisis.
The US Coast Guard planes and ships citing several hundred bodies so far. The number of passengers who survived isn't known, but it isn't large.
The US classifies the fleeing Haitians as economic migrants, requiring them to undergo screening to determine if they qualify for asylum. And in order to carry out this process without bringing them onto US soil, Guantanamo Bay becomes the base where their cases are reviewed. The camp grows quickly, with thousands of Haitians packed into a space never meant to hold them. The old airfield is turned into a sprawling tent city, one that soon grew enormously, as visible by these stunning pictures. And even this space was not enough. The golf course nearby was repurposed as well to become a temporary tent city. The base soon reaches maximum capacity, and the decision is made that anyone else encountered at sea will skip processing altogether and is forcibly sent back to Haiti.
They fled Haiti in hope of a better life. They're returning now in fear of their lives.
As for those that did make it to Guantanamo, they don't fare much better. Inside the perimeter, life is hard. Trash piles up, and food is often unevenly distributed as overcrowding strains the water and electricity supply. Even still, throughout this period between 1991 and 1995, many at Guantanamo did their best to improve the living conditions of the refugees.
We've had complaints of the food, and it did look pretty dismal to us.
It is dismal. I will make no apologies for the fact that the food is not good. It isn't good. As we get more food in, we'll start to vary the menu more, but right now the complaints are legitimate.
But with a situation thrust upon them with little logistical support from the US government, they simply have to make do with limited funding and resources. The residents of each small camp got to elect their own camp leaders, who in turn meet regularly with the generals to discuss possible improvements. Following these meetings, residents are given more autonomy, for example, having a say in meal planning and preparation. And inside the camps, the military police patrol unarmed, carrying only a radio. A sign both of the residents' peacefulness and of an effort to appear less like prison guards and more like peacekeepers. But the frustration that the individual service members can't ease comes from the fact that the camp's residents receive no answers about what will happen next. And even the military itself must wait on the White House. Life in these refugee camps was extremely hard. Rows of cots stretch out on concrete slabs, sometimes laying directly in the dirt. And if someone causes trouble, they are taken to a different location. Roughly 4.5 miles east of the airfield, a makeshift jail is built. Its name is Camp X-Ray. You can see the fencing around it, as well as multiple watchtowers encircling the camp. From this view, it might appear that these roofs belong to buildings housing the prisoners. But that is not what they are. This footage from 2021 shows the by now abandoned Camp X-Ray from the ground. As you can see when we zoom in, the roofs mostly cover cages where prisoners are kept. There are no walls, and the prisoners are exposed to the elements with no privacy. But these people at Camp X-Ray were not the only ones separated from the main camp. Going south, there is yet another camp being built, Camp Bulkley. The early 90s was a time during which a new fear began spreading like wildfire, fear of HIV. The spread of the epidemic led the American Center for Disease Control and Prevention to falsely label Haitians as a group with increased risk for contracting HIV. And because of this label, Haitians are screened much more intensely than any other nationality for the virus, with every Haitian national required to undergo testing. And if someone does test positive in Guantanamo Bay, they are removed from the general population and sent to Camp Bulkley. And the refugees are given bracelets that they are required to wear, identifying them as carriers of HIV. Out of over 20,000 Haitians, a total of 276 people are ultimately quarantined in Camp Bulkley, with little access to proper healthcare, and with their fate also unknown. These people are all individuals who have passed the screening to be granted asylum to the United States, but a 1987 law prohibits anyone with HIV from entering the country. This puts them into legal limbo. And when asked by an AP reporter why they cannot enter the US, a spokesperson for the US Immigration and Naturalization Service replied, "They're going to die anyway, aren't they?" Weeks turn into months, which turns into years. And after 2 years have passed, the Haitians imprisoned in Camp Bulkley still don't know their fate. Until, finally, a US federal court rules that Camp Bulkley is essentially an HIV prison camp, and it orders those living there to be evacuated. Within half a year, Camp Bulkley's residents are granted entry to the United States, and the camp officially closes. As for the rest of the Haitians waiting in Guantanamo Bay, they are soon joined by a different group of refugees, as yet another crisis led to a second influx of people on the base, this time from Cuba itself. After the fall of the Soviet Union, Cuba slipped into an economic crisis, sparking protests with people demanding better living conditions and political change. In 1994, this led to a massive surge in attempts by Cubans to reach Florida on makeshift rafts. Those who managed to make it to the United States were offered legal asylum, and at its peak, as many as 33,000 people set out on this journey. In response, the Clinton administration began taking action to stop it, and decides that any rafters intercepted at sea will also be taken to Guantanamo, adding even more stress to the already overcrowded refugee camp.
Guantanamo Bay is filling fast. Yesterday alone, a record 2,300 rafters were plucked from the Straits of Florida and brought here.
Eventually, the Clinton administration even goes so far to change policy. While it used to be that any Cuban rescued on the waters by the US Coast Guard would get to enter the United States, under the new policy, only those who actually make it to Florida with their self-made rafts get to stay. Everyone else will be sent back to Cuba.
Picking up those Cuban rafters, still putting out to sea for America, and then doing what would have been unthinkable before this, pulling into port in still communist Cuba, and handing those refugees back to Castro's police. Something America's never ever done before.
For the Cubans already at Guantanamo Bay, though, a lengthy legal and political battle took place to decide their fate, as well as the fate of the Haitian refugees. At one point during this time, a couple of Cuban detainees managed to escape from their camp, and they occupy a church on the base, located right next to the McDonald's. These Cubans were eventually brought back, and the area was cordoned off by the military. But the situation led to this fascinating photo being taken. The McDonald's at Guantanamo Bay, surrounded by barbed wire. A photo that became a powerful symbol of the base's contradictions. In 1995, after years of turmoil and waiting in limbo, the refugees can finally leave Guantanamo, and all of the camps are closed. By the mid-90s, Guantanamo had become a symbol of how the United States handles immigration, a reflection of a system that even today remains one of the country's most divisive and unresolved issues.
Given the nature of this country politically, do you have any hope that this immigration question is going to get resolved within this decade, Senator Simpson?
I really do.
And the use of the base as a place to hold migrants has only recently returned to the headlines, as President Trump announced plans to once again use Guantanamo Bay as a migrant facility.
We have 30,000 beds in Guantanamo to detain the worst criminal illegal aliens threatening the American people. And that's a tough place to get out of.
After the announcement, some tent camps were set up, and several hundred migrants, mostly from Venezuela, were held at the base for a period of time. But it was only temporary, and whether these announced plans will actually be carried out remains to be seen. And while Guantanamo made headlines in the 1990s as a refugee camp, in the early 2000s the camp becomes the spotlight for a different challenge that will define an entire decade.
The United States military has begun strikes against Al-Qaeda terrorist training camps and military installations of the Taliban regime in Afghanistan.
We know of targets in Kandahar and Kabul for certain, some 50 cruise missiles.
After the attacks of 2001, the United States began an invasion of Afghanistan, and on the ground, the American military begins taking prisoners. Except now, there's a problem. Many of the prisoners captured by the US were suspected to be terrorists, but the actual amount of evidence to legally justify detaining these people was often small. If they are sent back to the United States for a trial, it could be very likely that they are found not guilty. And so, once again, the American government turns its eye towards its previous location to deal with tricky situations, Guantanamo Bay. If a prisoner is sent here, they can still be imprisoned by the American military, but without any of the protections that being in the United States would otherwise give them, such as the right to a fair trial. And so, almost immediately suspected terrorists are shipped across the world to this base.
Terrorists who once occupied Afghanistan now occupy cells at Guantanamo Bay.
Guantanamo Bay was not well equipped to become a terrorist prisoner camp, and so the decision is made to use the temporary infrastructure of an already existing camp, Camp X-Ray, the same location where Haitian and Cuban refugees were sent if they caused issues during the refugee crisis.
The heat here is intense, and the guards say that it's baking inside the prison cells with their concrete floors and wire caging.
These photographs showing the first prisoners being taken to the camp were taken by the military, but they had not been published for years. Only through a New York Times Freedom of Information Act request they became public in 2022. The prisoners are shackled, their eyes and ears covered. They are essentially deprived their senses. One soldier plants an American flag in a prisoner's shackled hands. Other photos show the medical facilities where prisoners are checked. This photo shows a prisoner facing away as a guard brings food. After about 4 months, the detainees are moved to a new permanent location that is set up at the same place where the HIV camp used to be during the refugee crisis in the 90s. This camp is now called Camp Delta. Over the coming years, this camp is continuously expanded and is further broken down into several subcamps, ranging from low to high security prisons. A tiered system where the more compliant prisoner is moved to a lower security camp that has more freedoms, while the difficult detainees are kept at higher security. In the higher security camps, detainees are held in virtual solitary confinement. They are allowed only 2 hours of recreation time each day in individual pens, with no interaction allowed with the other prisoners. A little further east, also located directly by the ocean, Camp Iguana is set up to house free prisoners that were below the age of 16. Though later it was confirmed that there were other underage prisoners at Guantanamo that were not held at Camp Iguana. This photo shows the recreation yard at Camp Iguana, facing the sea. There's something fascinating about the contrast between the natural beauty of this place and the harshness of this prison camp. With all the different camps, there isn't a definitive system that dictates when prisoners should be moved between them. There are no trials and no review boards. The American government claims that the prisoners at Guantanamo are not protected by the US Constitution, as they are not on US territory. But there is still international law that dictates how a prisoner of war ought to be treated, and one of the things prohibited by the Geneva Conventions is indefinite imprisonment without charge or trial. And so, President Bush begins adopting a simple use of wordplay to skirt these restrictions by labeling the detainees as enemy combatants rather than prisoners of war. Several countries continually call for the closure of Camp Delta over human rights abuses, including the use of torture on detainees. Eventually, the Bush administration starts to backtrack. The government wants to close Camp Delta, but they can't as long as there are still prisoners. Hundreds of detainees are released or transferred, but many still remain. Unless the US is willing to simply release the remaining prisoners, which they are not, there has to be a trial. But you can't have a trial without a courtroom, of which there is none on the base. And so, the plan is made to build Camp Justice. Initially, Camp Justice was intended to be a permanent courthouse that would have cost around $100 million. However, Congress is not willing to allow such a budget. Politically, on the list of things to spend money on, a courthouse in Guantanamo is about as unpopular as it gets. Therefore, the budget is capped at just 1/10 of the initial proposal, $10 million. This isn't near enough to construct a brand new courthouse on a military base detached from the rest of the country. And so, the plan is reworked, and instead of a solid building, portable tents are set up yet again on the old airfield. It looks not too dissimilar to the tents that housed refugees just a decade earlier. Within those tents, the detainees are not given a trial like they would be entitled to in the US. Instead, they are military tribunals. Prisoners often don't have access to the evidence used against them to offer a rebuttal. Decisions don't need to be unanimous, and many parts of the tribunal are closed off to the public, sometimes even to the defendant's own attorneys. But over the years, this tent city has seen very little use. As of 2025, only 8 men have been convicted since Camp Justice has been established, and half of those convictions have since been overturned.
I have opposed the president on spending, on climate change, on torture of prisoners, on Guantanamo Bay.
I've said repeatedly that I intend to close Guantanamo, and I will follow through on that.
Barack Obama and John McCain said we need to close Guantanamo, but we all forgot to ask the next question: how?
Most of the hundreds of prisoners held in Camp Delta have instead been transferred to other countries, or they have been released with no charges after being held for years on end. And as of the making of this video, only 15 men are remaining. The cost per prisoner at the highest security federal prisons in the US is $78,000 per year. Based on official numbers from 2015, we know the cost of running just a prison facility at Guantanamo Bay. And based on the current population of prisoners, the cost per prisoner at Guantanamo comes out to a staggering $29 million. The term Guantanamo Bay is collectively linked to the War on Terror, as the camp continues to be controversial to this day. But really, this is just one of many chapters in the base's history that all follow one common theme. As the base is a reflection of America's uneasy relationship with the rest of the world. By wanting to help, but also wanting to control. By surrounding others, but yet feeling surrounded. By offering opportunity while building fences. And by defending ideals while sometimes suspending them when convenient. And as a place full of contradictions, the history of this base holds a mirror to over a century of foreign policy decisions. This is Guantanamo Bay. The War on Terror didn't just shape places like Guantanamo. It shaped an entire generation. It's one of those topics that's so huge, you can only really understand it by looking at all the smaller, stranger stories that came out of it. One of my favorite shows recently is Mad Kings. It covers some of the world's most unhinged dictators and corrupt leaders. For example, one episode tells the absolutely crazy life story of Uday, one of Saddam Hussein's sons, who committed thousands upon thousands of crimes during his father's reign in power. A documentary that would immediately get demonetized or age-restricted on YouTube. Which is why it was made exclusively for Nebula. Nebula is a streaming service that I helped build together with a bunch of like-minded creators, because we wanted to make bigger, weirder, and more meaningful stuff than what usually fits on YouTube. It is where I uploaded my 3D short film about the refugee crisis, and my exclusive series, Underexposure, which covers darker subject matters such as one episode about the Bin Laden raid. Everything on Nebula is made by independent creators, which honestly makes it way more creative than any other streaming service I know of, with documentaries, game shows, and really incredible film projects. I'm really excited about what we're building over on Nebula, and if you click on my link, you can try it for free yourself. And if you like it, it's just $3 a month using the annual plan. And there's also a lifetime plan option, which is currently discounted using my link. Thank you so much for watching this video.